Hey everyone, welcome to the themes video for Julian of Norwich and Margery Kempe. And while sometimes I've warned about spoilers in the text, this time I'd actually encourage you to watch this video before reading because I think it will help you to make sense of both readings even more fully. So my first question, you can almost see the full word of Margery Kempe here, is something similar to what I asked last week with the Man of Law's tale and the Wife of Bath's tale. There is much to be gleaned about these two writers simply by comparing them with one another. Now, from one perspective, they're incredibly similar. They're both women writers in English with religious interests, writing about personal experiences in the late 14th and 15th centuries in East Anglia, England. That is a crazy amount of similarities to talk about here. So what commonalities do you see within their writing? How do you see them as being similar writers or engaged with similar ideas? At the same time, they're profoundly different from one another. And just one example is the fact that Julian is completely stationary, never leaving her spot. And Margery Kempe travels all around Europe and the Near East, an incredibly large region. So, what differences do you see within their writing? There are a number of significant differences between their writing as well. Now, moving forward, I'm going to ask you to think about a number of words, images, and themes in both writers' works. And I'd like you to think about what those words, images, and themes mean in your discussion posts. So, when it comes to Julian's A Revelation of Love, here are 6 words and themes to be on the watch for. The first is blood. Julian has a vision of Christ suffering and dying, and she pays a lot of attention to his blood dripping down his forehead. It's hot and freshly, and she's not talking about a pizza. She's talking about his blood. So why would she talk about his blood in that way? That's a question worth thinking about. She also talks a lot about union with God, and she uses a great Middle English word. You'll notice it. In our making, he knit us and wonned us to himself, by which wonning we be kept as clean and, as noble as we were made. Okay, you might be thinking, that's not a word. Won is not a verb. In Middle English, it is totally a verb, and it's very evocative. She's talking about being wonned with someone, made one with God. What significance does that have? You may notice the number 3 come out through her work. You may be familiar with the Trinity in the Christian faith. The Father, the Son, or Jesus, and the Holy Spirit. They compose the Trinity in the Christian faith. She also has really interesting ideas about sin. She claims sin is behovely or fitting. Sin is, in other words, a good thing. Why does she think sin is a good thing? That's something to think about. Now, these final 2 I'm especially interested in. She claims that Jesus, and thus is Jesu, our very mother. Jesus is a mother from Julian's perspective. As she writes, the mother may give her child suck in her milk, but our precious mother, Jesu, he may feed us with himself, and doth full courteously and full tenderly with the blessed sacrament that is precious food of very life. So in other words, while a mother breastfeeds her child, Jesus feeds us with his blood through the Eucharist, through the sacrament of the Eucharist, when you have my body and my blood. That's a really important comparison for her. And I want you to think back to that painting we looked at when we were talking about affective piety. Look at the way Jesus is presenting and extending his wound to the viewer, and notice its proximity to the breast. So Julian of Norwich is not the only person to think of Christ and his wound in this way, in an almost motherly way, in which Jesus takes on a female body and his wound becomes a site of feeding, essentially a site of breastfeeding. So I'd like you to think about the role of motherhood in Julian's work. And then finally, enclosure. As she says, he is our clothing that for love wrappeth us and windeth us, halseth us, and all becloses us. There's this sense of being enclosed and safe in that enclosure that Julian finds very evocative. We could think back to her enclosure in the anchor hold itself, a very small space. We can also think about the enclosure that a female body provides, or a mother's body provides, which is the womb. There's a sense that we are enwombed in God's love. He has wrapped us within his motherly womb. Okay, in Margery Kempe's book, I have a few themes I would also like you to be paying attention to. The first thing we might know is that she writes in the third person. Now, that might simply be because she's dictating her story to an amanuensis, and instead of saying I, the amanuensis writes she, because they're talking about she or her. But that's still a choice. That's still a narrative choice. So I want you to think about what choice, what effect that choice, has on the story. In tandem with this third person thing is how Margery refers to herself as creature throughout the book. When this creature was 20 years of age or somewhat more, she was married to a worshipful burgess, etc. Why do you think she refers to herself as a creature? And what effect do you think that word has on her own self-presentation? Kempe also has an incredibly interesting range of emotion in this work. Here's one example. She had such holy thoughts and such holy visions that she might not control her weeping nor her crying. And therefore the people had great marvel of her, supposing that she had wept for some fleshly or earthly affection, and said unto her, What ails you, woman? Why do you fare thus with yourself? We knew him as well as you, talking about Jesus. She seems to value her emotional acuity, her emotional range, as something that gives her special insight into the world and into her relationship with Jesus. I want you to be thinking about the role that emotion plays in her work. She also has a very interesting relationship with time. In one moment when she's viewing a Pieta, in other words, a view of Jesus dying and Mary holding Jesus, she says, Sir, his death is as fresh to me as if he had died this same day. And so I think it ought to be to you and to all Christian people. For her, it's as if Jesus is dying every day. She's kind of like in this present now of Jesus's death that she lives in intentionally. So there's a very interesting sense of time in Kempe's book where she's both living in a biblical present as well as a medieval present. The second quote only reiterates that feeling where she feels like she sees Jesus suffering in daily scenes of life. It kind of permeates daily scenes of life. Why do you think that is? And then finally, probably one of the most surprising, shocking features of Kempe's book is the, in fact, physically intimate relationship that she has with Jesus. We see them get married. I take you, Margery, for my wedded wife. That's Jesus speaking, not an earthly man. And then here's another speech that Jesus gives to Margery in her book. Therefore must I needs be homely. Homely means like familiar, like at home. Therefore must I needs be homely with you and lie in your bed with you. Daughter, you desire greatly to see me, and you may boldly, when you are in your bed. Take me to you as your wedded husband, as your most worthy darling, and as your sweet son. For I will be loved as a son should be loved by the mother, and will that you love me, daughter, as a good wife ought to love her husband. And therefore you may boldly take me in the arms of your soul, and kiss my mouth, my head, and my feet as sweetly as you will. Okay, so in this speech, Jesus is inviting Margery to be intimate, physically intimate with him. There's also a lot of perplexing familial relationships that he proposes here, right? He says, I will be loved as a son should be loved by the mother. So there's mother, son. And will that you love me, daughter. So then now we have daughter, father. As a good wife ought to love her husband. So there are a lot of familial relationships being collapsed in Margery's intimate relationship with Jesus that I find very thought-provoking and interesting. So I would love to hear your thoughts on how Margery depicts this physical intimacy with Jesus and why she does that as well. Okay, that wraps up our video of themes in Julian of Norwich and Margery Kempe this week. Really looking forward to your posts.